maintaining his name, commemorating his name, but his center. And I saw from the people who have been in this program before and people who are going to participate in the future that they all somehow have to do with Iran and its struggle for democracy and bringing peace to our region. Coming to Iran and Israel, let me say about Iran, it's one thing which is, I think, it's so obvious. I think Iran is a very complex country. That's the starting point that we have to remember every time we speak about Iran. It's not total black, not total white. There are many, many colors and many, many different attitudes and positions and views points between people in its history. In the 19th century or second half of the 19th century, we could see how the country is struggling to find a way to the progress of Iran or modernity in Iran. And I think that we have to remember that the Iranian identity is based on complex of different pillars. I would say that basically three. One is the ancient or the national. Don't want to say the imperial, but it goes back to the ancient history of Iran. The second is Islamic or Shiite from the 16th century. And the third is Western. And many people, when I speak about the Western element in Iranian identity, they find it very strange. But Iran is, in many ways, it is in the modern world, in its policies even. It's true that they are going every day, that to America, that to Israel, that to here and there, everybody. But if you look, if all the huge change between the Shah and Ayatollah Khomeini, the Shah wished to take Iran to secularism, westernization, close to the United States, friendly with Israel, monarchy. The Islamic revolution went to entirely different way. Islamization, against nationalism, denying nationalism, supranational identity, anti-American, anti-Israeli. But at the end of the day, if you ask yourself, with all this ambition to go back in history, not to go back to the 7th century of early Islam, but to go to the values of the past and forget about the impact of the West. But when you look at their policy, they remain faithful to what the Shah has done or Iran has done since the late 19th century. Parliamentarism, in which struggle Baskerville was part, is a Western principle. Their republicanism is Western. Constitutionalism is not Iranian philosophy. You can look at their education system that both Matthew and myself have done studies on. It is based on Western education system. So they are struggling between the extremes of the three. What the Shah wished to do is exactly the opposite of what Ayatollah Khomeini proposed to do. But let me here say a preliminary comment about basic issues that I think are important for people to know about Iran. We speak about Islamic Republic, Islamic regime, Islamic terrorism, Islamic whatever, everything is Islamic. But I would claim that the Islamic revolution, what was Islamic only in the Islamic meaning of the word, because the revolution was social, economic, political. People didn't go to the revolution, and I lived in Iran the last 2 years of the Shah, and I know that some of the people now attending have been there at that time. I don't think that what people in Iran wished to achieve at that time was to go back to the principles of Islam or to bring about Islamic Republic. They wanted to provide better conditions for their children to live. Health, education, liberties, I would say in 2 words, bread and freedom, welfare and liberties. 42 years after, I think this has not been yet achieved. But we have to recognize that we speak about Islamic revolution also in terms of it, not of its origins, but also about its doctrine. Islam is a huge ocean of knowledge. There are so many different interpretations of Islam. And just it would be sufficient to say when Ayatollah Khomeini came victorious to Iran in 79, I think it was today, in 1st of January that he came back from Paris. It's in 79, when Ayatollah Khomeini came back to Paris. There have been 7 grand Ayatollahs in Iran at that time, 7 major authorities in Islam. None of them supported Ayatollah Khomeini's doctrine. The man that Ayatollah Khomeini prepared or appointed actually to be his successor was removed from grace and put under house arrest during the lifetime of Ayatollah Khomeini. The number 1 Ayatollah in Iran at that time, Shariat Madari, was under house arrest the last 6 years of his life in the 80s. So we can see different interpretations. I think the best way to illustrate is to bring you a sentence that I heard from Professor Soroush, who said the sentence that I think it tells everything. There is one Islam. Of course there is one Islam. But, he says, there is no one interpretation of Islam. No one interpretation is better than the other. There is no final interpretation of Islam, and there can be no official interpretation of Iran. Namely, that there are so many different interpretations. I know the traditional things do not change fast, but they still change. And what we see even today in Iran, there's the struggle between what is the true, the right interpretation of Islam. Take Shiite Islam, Iranian Ithna Ashari Shiite Islam. Now you have Ayatollah Khomeini, now it's Khamenei is the supreme leader. But you have another Iranian Ayatollah who lives in Iraq, Ayatollah Sistani, who doesn't agree with the principles of the Velayat Faqih and the way it has been interpreted today in Iran. The other question is that appears in any revolution in history. There is difference between what people say in opposition and what they do after coming to power. Well, maybe in America, your president will do exactly what he said, but it usually doesn't happen. In opposition, while you're running for office, you promise what you want to do. When you are power, you can do only what you can do. And here is the struggle between the ideology and the interest of the state, the interest of the revolution, or the interest of the current regime. In Iran, when these two issues clashed, as long as your ideology fits what you want to do, that's fine. But when there is a clash between interest and ideology, between national interest and ideology, you have to choose. And usually, what the Iranians have done, they have chosen to retreat from dogma for the sake of, for interest. And already in 1987, Ayatollah Khomeini made this statement that for the sake of interest is even allowed to destroy a mosque. You don't expect Ayatollah to say such a thing. And expediency has been the main guide for life. Now to come to Iran and Israel. I can say for the Jewish people, they have a very positive view about Iran since Cyrus the Great. He is a benevolent Shah who granted freedom to Jews to go from exile and to build their temple. By the way, Cyrus the Great is the only non-Jewish leader who is being praised in the Old Testament. What we call in Israel Bible, but it was taken. Today we have to just speak about Old Testament. So it means that in Jewish history, Iran has a pride of place in human history. Through the and since then there have been Jews living in Iran for over 25 centuries. Sometimes in good conditions, sometimes there have been problems, suffering from discrimination, but there was a constant history of life of Jews in Iran. So I don't think that there are people in Israel who are waking in the morning and say, well, what can I do to destroy Iran? I would say at the same time, I don't think that the people of Iran wake up in the morning and say, well, what can I do today to destroy the state of Israel? Believe me, they have much more important things on the table. They wake up in the morning and want to make sure that their children, their families will have better life. So in principle, when it comes to people, I don't think there is a big issue. And I'll come to it later on, even when we speak about these harsh statements of each side on the other and activities that are being done and hostilities between the two. Iran and Israel don't share a border. Iran and Israel did not have a war with each other. No Israeli soldier was killed on the border of Iran, and no Iranian soldier was killed on the border of Israel. This is a recipe for having friendly relations. Under the Shah, there were good relations between the two countries. At that time, Israel, as a newborn state, 1948, was searching to be accepted in the Muslim Middle East. Since the Arab countries, neighboring countries, did not accept Israel as legitimate, Israel, the Prime Minister of Israel, Ben Gurion, one of the admirers of Cyrus the Great, and he wrote an article about him. Ben Gurion was looking for the second tier, if you don't have your immediate neighbors don't accept you, go to the neighbors of the neighbors. Well, we can say differently, the enemies of the enemies. And Israel developed good relations with three countries in what we call periphery. God forbid, you don't call Iran is not a peripheral state. It's very central to the life of civilization in the Middle East. But from the distance from Israel, they've been the periphery. Turkey, Iran, and Ethiopia. For Israel, having been recognized by Turkey first, and then by Iran, it was a relief. It was something that Israel was looking for as a sign of being admitted to the community of nations of the Middle East. The Shah at that time had his own interest to be friendly with Israel. He saw Israel as a successful story of a nation state, which is religious but secular, a Jewish state but secular, a prototype of what he probably wished to do in his country. It is a country that is successful also militarily, but not mainly, in health, in agriculture, in industry, in science, and is viewed this collaboration good for Iran. It was also good for him that Israel was confronted by the Arab countries, and I believe he thought that as long as Israel fights with the Arabs will leave him alone. Maybe he was right, because immediately after the first peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, there was a war in Iraq and Iran. But I think for him, it was good to have a friend which is far away and he can benefit. I must also admit that he believed in the power of the Jews to help him in Washington. If you access on the YouTube to find his interview with Wallace and what he said about Israelis in banking, in media, and so on and so forth. So he had his own reasons to have good relations, and relations developed to be love story. But they have never been formal. Iran did not recognize Israel de jure. Only de facto it was recognized. For example, Israel didn't have embassy in Tehran. Israel did not, it had building and it was an economic mission. No flag of Israel. The license of the cars of the ambassador were not diplomatic license. But beneath the surface, if you go down, relations were very good, mutual visits, mutual cooperation. In many areas, we don't have time to go into it. I'll give one example. There have been in the late 70s, 2 Israeli schools in the world. One of them was in Tehran. It shows you the centrality of Iran in Israeli foreign outlook and foreign relations. There have been earthquakes in Qazvin in the early 70s, in the 60s, and Israelis professionals went and helped reconstruct and rebuild the villages in Iran. So when I was in Tehran, I asked a friend who was in the foreign ministry, so why we don't have formal relations? He told me that sometimes it's better not to have formal relations. So it's like a relations of love without marriage contract. And believe me, he said, he had his own reasons, it is sometimes better than having a marriage contract, but fighting with each other. So we had these relations of love without marriage contract, and both sides were happy with it. In the midst of it, we have Jewish community in Israel. There are something like 250,000 Jews who live in this small country of 9-10 million people who are of Iranian origin. I have been president of the Central Organization of Iranian Jews for several years after the revolution to try and take care, integrate the newcomers into Israeli society. And I can tell you, people that I met, it's unbelievable how much they adore Persian culture, Persian literature, Persian poetry, and they are attached to Iran emotionally, unlike Jews who came from Iraq or from Egypt or from Yemen or from other countries. I once gave a lecture in a synagogue near Tel Aviv to meet with newcomers, new immigrants. And I gave them a whole hour speech about how to to turn better Israelis, to come to adjust it to Israel. At the end of my talk, someone, now I used to say that old man, but he was probably younger than I am today. He said, Professor Menashri, I want to ask you, when do you think we can go back to our homeland? This was shocking for me. You just came from Iran, who is in the midst of war and revolution, and you are asking me when you can go back to your homeland, Iran? I was offended. But that shows you, for many people, Iran, they are attached to Iran. When Khomeini came to power, everything has changed. Although Iran has been pragmatic in its attitude to many issues on their agenda, as I said, when there is a clash between interest and doctrine, interests usually win. I say in the case of Israel, it's one of the rare cases which there is no clash between the two. Ideologically, they are against Israel because they don't recognize that Judaism is nationality, Judaism is religion. The Jews don't have the right to have a state of themselves, certainly not in the Middle East, of course not in the holy lands of Palestine. So the conflict between the two states, it's not political. It used to be with PLO or with or national with Egypt or other countries. It's ideological. It's religious. So this is the contribution of Iran, so that to the conflict that they really color the Israeli-Arab conflict with religious colors. This is a struggle between the absolute good and the absolute bad. One of them has to diminish for the other one to survive. Israel is an agent of imperialism. It's acting on behalf of the Americans. And honestly, I don't know if they hate America so much because of Israel, or they hate Israel so much because of Iran, of the United States. They identify with the Palestinian issue. Israel was close to the Shah, so it should not be accepted. But above it, I think what the existence in Israel shows that history has gone on the wrong direction. In ordinary times, Islam is the last monotheistic religion, and Islam should be the leading force in human history. What happened with the foundation of Israel is that actually so many Muslims live under Jewish control. That's something which religiously is unacceptable. So far for the ideological side. So what about the pragmatic reasons to change? I don't see much pragmatic reason. They suffer from their animosity to Israel, but I think that what they pay is less than they gain. They gain centrality in the Middle East. If you want to be the leader of the Muslim world or the Muslim Middle East, you have to raise the flag of Jerusalem. Whenever there is any problem inside Iran, they blame it on the Israelis or the Jews or the Americans. It's always good to have a scapegoat, someone to blame for your own problems. Why the inflation is so high is because of Israel and so on and so forth. And I don't know how far they can go and how long they can go with it. Iran is supported the fundamentalist Islamist movements, and they continue to support them. I was giving a lecture in somewhere in Europe, and I spoke about Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad needed Israel as an enemy. For him to speak against Israel and blame Israel for everything, this was his ticket to his leadership. Unfortunately, there are some people in Israel are doing the same, trying to blaming the Iranians. I must admit that there are in Iran people, brave, courageous people, who speak differently. I won't give you names, but you have intellectuals who ask the question. They say, I, for one, recognize that the state of Israel exists. Who gave us the right? Who gave us the duty to fight Israel? Did the Palestinians ask us to do it? Did the UN ask us? Did we hold referendum? And they blame the government to have turned, they say in Persian, Kasedok Taraz Ash, which is plate, which is warmer than the soup. If you have a soup, the soup is warm, but the dish, the plate, is not warmer. Why you have come to be more pious than the Pope, if you speak in Christian way? So there are such people in Iran, and they continue to raise the voice very courageously. What is the problem that Israel have with Iran? Iran has developed a very radical ideology. It is developing nuclear weapon. It's very close to achieve it. It supports proxies and groups that are acting against Israel, be it Hamas, Palestinian Jihad, the Hezbollah, and others. They are involved in acts of terrorism. And I don't think I have to go on. And for Israel, the issue of Iran becoming nuclear is very, very significant. I was convinced with it when I heard President Ahmadinejad. Immediately after he was elected, he went to no president in Iran will miss the opportunity to visit New York. And they have once a year the opportunity to go to the United Nations General Assembly. In his first visit, he talked there for 27 minutes, he said, and then when he came back, he was sitting on the floor speaking with an Ayatollah, and he told him, during this 27 minutes that I was talking in the UN, no one whispered. Everyone was silent. All eyes were glued to me because he said, I was told and I noticed myself, there was a hail of light above my head with God protection. People who speak in such a language cannot have access to push the button of the nuclear bomb. I must admit that I was not against the nuclear deal. I was not against because this was a done deal that Israel could not change. And what I said, it was published in newspapers, that a bad deal is better than no deal. Obama has gone a long way with Iran in these negotiations. They reach something which is not perfect, but at least allow some time with the hope. And now people say hope is not strategy, but there was a hope that is to go into this agreement and take it from there. Europe will do business, they will need us, we'll do business, we'll then continue. But the United States is withdrawn from the nuclear deal. So what will he achieve with this withdrawal? Iran is closer today to the nuclear energy and the bomb, I would say, than it has been in May 1918 when President Trump decided to withdraw. Unfortunately, we are staying in a situation that it's very difficult to find compromise, because now the problem is not anymore the nuclear deal, there is a whole package. Iran's behavior in the region, Iran's record on human rights, and there is no way you can settle all these issues at one time. And time is running out. I must admit that Israeli policy has not been what I wished it to be. I'll give you an example. I didn't like Ahmadinejad and his denial of Holocaust. But to speak all the time about Ahmadinejad being Hitler and Iran Nazi Germany, it doesn't serve any Jewish purposes. The first time that a prime minister, he was not prime minister at the time, Netanyahu said he made this comparison. It was in a meeting, this conference of the Jewish communities of North America. And he spoke in the plenary, I spoke in the session after him together with his chief political advisor, now his bitter enemy. And the whole 40 minutes or something that Netanyahu spoke, he said, ladies and gentlemen, there is 1938 and Iranian Germany. In our panel, I spoke first, I was asked to speak first, and I started my talk saying, ladies and gentlemen, the year is not 1938 and Iran is not Germany. Well, that doesn't matter how bad is Ahmadinejad and how much I dislike his Holocaust denier. But if we, in my lifetime, Nasser was Hitler, Arafat was Hitler, Saddam Hussein was Hitler, now Ahmadinejad is Hitler, what I am going to tell my children and grandchildren who was Hitler all about? We are trivializing and downgrading the historical significance of the Holocaust. But you know, people are attracted by it. We say you make this comparison, you go on and say what this kind of talks. I didn't like the Israeli phrase existential threat. And the head of our center, Alliance Center for Iranian Studies, she told me she will be on this session. We in the center, when we established the center, we conducted a survey of public opinion, what they think about existential threat. And everything is available, I think it's online. 1 out of 4 Israelis say that if Iran is going nuclear, they will think seriously to leave the country. That's the message I want to deliver to the Iranians. What is the message in existential threat? That when Iran is having it, and they will ultimately have nuclear energy and a weapon. So our children have to leave the country. This is the message I want to give to the Iranians, that we are frightened from you, you can destroy Israel. The message should be Israel is indestructible. Iran cannot destroy the state of Israel, period. So giving these examples, speaking so much about this, now it's Biden is coming and the chief of staff of Israel is giving his guidelines, what they have to do. I think Israel should go back to its normal small place. Take a back seat, not to be on the front. It doesn't help us to be on the front. And help Americans and others, give them the information, give them the advice. What can be done to solve this problem? I don't envy President Biden. He doesn't have much time. The nuclear clock is ticking. The Iranians are stubborn, and they are now believing that they have the opportunity to pressure the president, who expresses willing to renew the deal. And let me stop by giving you one observation that I hope it is properly understood. I think one of the problems that Israel has with Iran, that we are very similar in many ways. I hope the Iranians are not offended. Here are 2 ancient civilizations trying to establish new states functioning in modern times. Both of us, we think we are the chosen people. Shiite Muslims and Jews, we think we are chosen by God or by the Imam. And both of us believe that we have been deprived throughout history. Both of us suffered trauma in the 20th century. And I would not make any comparison between the Holocaust and anything else in human history or modern human history. But I can say that the trauma of the Holocaust is fresh in the mind of all Israeli politicians. And I think that the Iranians have also their trauma. In the war, in 8 years of war between Iraq and Iran, when the two sides, when they believed that the entire world is against them, and they were close to really collapse. The other thing that we have in common, we are two nations that find it very difficult to cope with success. Many nations have problems with coping with failures. Israelis and Iranians, seems to me, their problem coping with success. The Islamic Revolution was a success story. The question how you translate it to elevate the state and nation. The story of establishment of Israel is a success story. The 67 war was a success story. But we spend the credits that we have without going to any solution with our neighbors. And finally, the problem in Iran is that people who want to make compromise don't have the power, and people who have the power to take a step don't want to do it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David, for that really excellent presentation. It's so difficult, as you know, with all the developments taking place every day between Iran and Israel, for us to keep that historical perspective in mind. And as you rightly put it, one of the principal missions of our institute is to look beyond rhetorics and the conflict and see how this narrative kind of prevents us from realizing what brings the bond and friendship together. And thank you so much again for your placing this issue on the historical context. So before we go to Matt and we start the question, I wanted to just start by asking you about the Iranian community in Israel. You mentioned there are about 250,000 Iranian Jews and more. So I would assume that they're mostly second generation too, that those who went to Israel in 1979 are now have families in Israel, they're second generation. How would you evaluate their integration into the Israeli political system? Meaning, what type of political sides do they take when it comes to that fractious politics of Israel, elections and all that? And how do you see them compared to other immigrant groups adjusting to that political conditions in Israel?
It's very difficult to make generalization on this issue. And the question is, we have many years in Israel, the question was, who is a Jew? Now we are asking who is an Israeli Jew, Iranian Jew. I had this meeting, it's with the organization that we have to give scholarship to Iranian students from Iranian descent. And they spoke on me to have to give the scholarship only to Iranians. And I looked around the table. Most of the board have been either born in Iran or their families came from Iran. And then I realized out of 10, 8 of them are married to non-Iranians. I mean, take my own family. My wife was born in Germany. She came to Israel at the age of 2. I was born in Iran. I came at the age of 5. My children don't speak Persian. My grandchildren got certainly not. The only thing that they know from Iran is the food. I would say not even the music. So it's very difficult to say how they feel about it. Generally speaking, and now I am editing for the Center of Iranian Studies a book about the immigration and of Iranian Jews from Iran to Israel. That because we realized that we don't have documentation of all these people who came to Israel and how they have been absorbed into Israel. I can say from my observations that they have been well integrated into Israeli society. But then the question is the relation to Persian culture. And it depends. I've said there are three periods, I would say, of Iranian Jews who came to Israel. The beginning of the Zionist immigration was in the late 19th century when Jews came from Iran, 1895. They are well integrated. I don't think there is any issue of their culture, but of course, this happened to be one of the most important families of artists in Israel, singers in Israel. So you can see in their music also some Persian words here and there. But the two big waves of immigration, one was from 1948 to 51, 52. And the other was what I call Khomeini's immigrants, 79 and into the 80s. These are the two big waves. People who came in the 40s, they are usually the lower class, relatively speaking, who came out of Zionism. Those who came in 79 have been well established in Iran, many of them rich. I wrote somewhere, I hope it was true for the time, it was the richest and the most educated Iranian Jews in Tehran than any other community of Jews in the world per capita. They were rich, they were educated. Under the Shah, student organizations, I think you lived in Iran at that time, Bahman, student organizations were not lawful. It was not legal to have students movement, student organization. The only student organization it was legal in Iran was the Jewish organization of students. I gave lectures there. They felt free. They have been felt Iranians. So, and I recently heard that talk by Alan Dershowitz speaking about the Iranian Jews in America. He said it's the community that's been absorbed better than any other community. Probably he was paid to give the talk for Iranian Jews, so he gave them more compliment than they deserve. But they have been really well established. Go to Los Angeles, go to Great Neck. God forbid, I cannot say even Great Neck. You have to get Kingstown. It's for the people who are familiar with the area. It's a better place to live. Or say Los Angeles is not Los Angeles, it's Beverly Hills area. They are well integrated. The Jews of Iran, in Israel, when you come, your children go to the military, they turn to be Israelis. I don't think that they read Persian newspapers, certainly not the generation that my parents came. No, my parents' family generation is not alive mostly, but I think that, but you can see difference. Those who came after 79 would still follow Iranian news. They may have watch Persian television and go to websites to read. And there are Facebook groups of Jews who came from Kashan, Isfahan, Yazd, and so in so many different places. So there is a trend to go back to the roots and discover your parents, grandparents' heritage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, David. I will ask one more question from another participant, and then I'll pass it to Matt, who would kind of summarize the questions and also ask more questions. One of our colleagues, Laura Rosen, who you're familiar with and know her publication, she writes, I think, for Al Monitor. She asks this question: current Israeli political leadership encouraged Trump to leave the Iran nuclear deal. And as you mentioned, is warning Biden not to try to return to it. What do you think the Israeli political leadership wants on Iran? To keep Iran issue unsolved for political advantages? Does it reject a diplomatic solution that would legitimize the Islamic Republic? That was a summary of her question to you.
I think Laura can answer these questions better than I do. We are now in the eve of elections in Israel, and I don't want to sound too political. It is probably true that Israel is encouraged Trump to get out of the nuclear. I don't think it did it because of Israel, but Israel added its voice to it. Like, I don't think that the Israelis pushed President Bush to invade Iraq, but I think that there was an administration there that they were entertaining this idea, and Israel added the voice, and for some reason they find it Israeli advice worth of following or accepting. I was not happy when he left the ACPOA. I think that it was a mistake, and I think that right now I still believe it was a mistake. But the question is how you know, Iran. If you ask the Iranians, which country has made the greatest services to America, to Iranian national interest, there is only one answer to it: the United States of America. Not because of good intentions. America has come to the region, smashed the military power of Saddam Hussein in 1991. Then 2002, it went to remove the enemy number 2 of Iran, the Taliban in Afghanistan. 2003, they removed the Saddam Hussein. And actually, it made Iran free from its 2 wings to become a superpower. The next step was 2009, when students went to riots and uprisings in Tehran, and the president of Iran did not say a word. I don't think that if he would have said something, it would have changed much. But many people in Iran wish to hear the Obama saying something like he said 2 years after to President Hosni Mubarak: you must go now. Then 2015, the most valuable gift for the Islamic Revolution was the nuclear deal. It was recognizing the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic and its nuclear program. We say in Hebrew to give them a kosher stamp, that it's okay. So these are things that have been done by American administrations. Unfortunately, that the Iranians have their own peculiar way to thank America for all these services. And death to America every day. I think that it's about time that they will wake up. Their people are suffering. We started with remember your humanity. But Iranians are human beings, and their people are suffering today with Corona even more than before. And it's up to the government to sit together and come out with solution how you promote understanding between the 2 nations. Forget about Israel. I don't think Israel can do much harm at this stage. It is up to the 2 sides. And now we have changes, geostrategic change in the region. You have this Israeli normalization with the Emirates, with Bahrain. Israel's good news for Israel. We have relations with Kosovo. I don't think these are the major issues at this stage. But if they are, there is something in them that's based on mutual animosity to Iran. Change this record and go back to something positive. And this can be done by the United States and by Iran. Americans have already said that they are ready to do it. Iranians not yet officially stated. They make preconditions, and I can tell you, if you take their preconditions, it's no way they can go on. But you know, in any such negotiations, you say something, the other one says something, and you have to find solutions. Find the solution that on the one hand, remove the threat of Iran being a military nuclear power. On the other hand, giving hand to the young people of Iran or not young people of Iran to continue their life. Iran is a great civilization. It's a wonderful civil society. If you look at their newspapers, if you look at their intellectuals and their universities, they are of the leadings in the Middle East. And people deserve better life. And I said before, I believe that the aim of the revolution was not what type of regime will be there, but on two major criteria of freedom and welfare. And this is something that the revolution has not yet offered solution.
Great. Thank you very much for that answering that question, David. So Matt, could you start now with some of the other topics that our audience has sent for David?
Sure. And we have a wide range of really good questions here. And because some are related, I'll try to put them together for time's sake. There is interest in, I think you spoke really well about the kind of, when we think of the three images of analysis available to political scientists interested in global affairs, the individual, the state, and the international system, I felt like you did a really good job speaking about some of the individuals at play and national leaders. And you really laid out the nature of the international system over many decades. But some viewers are interested more in that domestic level of analysis, especially on the Israeli side. So one question indicates that many outside of Israel tend to think that everyone in Israel would agree with the government and the Netanyahu administration, but they suspect that it's much more complicated than that. And they wonder if you could speak to different segments of Israeli society, how they view Iran and all the issues at play. And another question related to that is about the political orientations of the Iranian community in Israel. So just like in the United States, we have a very robust Iranian American community with multiple generations and many viewpoints. We're wondering if we have different viewpoints among different groups of the Iranian community in Israel. So really the question is about the diversity of views that may exist or may not exist in Israel about Iran today.
Jews have a good tradition of diversities and arguing between themselves on each and every issue. When it comes to a question of Iran, there is a big of debate. There are different views in the Israeli society. Now, I cannot tell you that the Iranian Jews of Israel have any particular color or belong to a particular side. It is not ethnic, I would say. It's socioeconomic. If you look at this voters of left and right, for whatever it means, because it doesn't have real much meaning. But to take, for example, people who live in North Tel Aviv, which is well-to-do people, or towns that are more, no, the inhabitants are of higher education level, income, you will find them more not following Bibi Netanyahu. And then you go to the periphery, and the periphery can be in the city, periphery that can be south of Tel Aviv, or Jaffa, or parts of Jerusalem. But if you go to small towns in the north or south, it's I think that's to do with the level of education, level of income, and the socioeconomic background of the families. And here you can find these differences. There are recently more voices from the third generation of the Jews who came from the 50s, who have been much more radical in their attitude to the founding fathers who have been left-wing Labor Party of that time. The Iranians, you don't hear collective views. I've been involved in this organization of Iranian Jews in Israel. What we have done is to providing services, help to the needy. In 1979, to help them to be admitted to university. Help them, it means, for example, the young Jews who came in 79, 80 from Iran, they usually did not come with certificates because they had to go to the military before they get their high school certificate. So you had to help them to, that they will recognize, for example, they came without driving license. Not to speak of some people who didn't have document to show that they are Jews, and in Israel it matters. So we help them in adjusting to Israel. But most of the leaders of the community belong to the labor or to the left. More of the, I think the voters belong more to the right, if this is the right term. The Iranian Jews, you know, today there are many, there was time that there have been no Jews from Middle Eastern countries in Israeli government. There have been two positions in government that were allocated to Middle Eastern Jews. One was the Minister of Post, Telephone, Telegraph, now it's communication. And the other was today's domestic security. At that time, it was Ministry of Police, which is not highly regarded. Today, more than half of the government, I think it's more than half, are from the Middle East. So there is a huge change from the 50s and 60s to our days. The problems that we have in Israel is that there is a huge antagonism and clashes and disagreements between different segments of society, not necessarily on a background where they came from, but for example, Jews, Orthodox and secular. It's a big issue today in Israel, mainly during the days of Corona. When there is lockdown and you have two funerals of great rabbis yesterday, in one of them there were more than 10,000 people going. No police could stop them. And then there are people saying, okay, when my father passed away, we couldn't even go 30 people to the cemetery. Now how you allow 10,000 to go? So that's one issue. The other one is the Arab citizens of Israel. That's another group that is underprivileged. And you can see these two communities together are more than half of the people who have been diagnosed positive recently for corona. They don't observe enough. They have big parties. All schools in Israel are closed except for the school of the Orthodox. So there is tension in Israel, and the repeated elections, which is this time next month, is the 4th in 2 years. It doesn't make situation better because every decision being taken, you already think that this is based on political considerations and not objective diagnosis of the problems and providing the remedy.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions that deal with the kind of more somber side of Israel-Iran relations. So many folks are very interested to hear the points you make about history of kind of shared histories, cultures of shared histories. But they acknowledge that there's a lot going on in the region that maybe kind of overrides memories of Cyrus or whatever it may be. And so some questions read like this. Would Israel be willing to make peace with the Palestinians in order to unlock a larger rapprochement with the Islamic Republic? Do you think that Israel would give up its nuclear arsenal in order to kind of de-escalate the potential for a nuclear arms race in the region, of course, in exchange for Iranian agreements on their nuclear program? And we have multiple questions about Syria, and I would just put Syria on the table and ask how you might respond to those that see proxy wars and competitions in nations like Syria as a potential barrier to any progress.
Well, about Cyrus, let me mention one thing. I spoke with you and Bainam yesterday. The Israeli government issued a stamp 5 years ago to honor Cyrus the Great. I think this is I was involved in it. I also made sure that while Israel has 3 official languages, that on the stamp will be written in 4 languages, including Persian. We have Arabic, English, and Hebrew, and we added also the Persian. So I think it's a gesture of recognition, and our children go to school. I think that the only thing they learn about Iran is about Cyrus the Great. Recently, we can see that in the Jewish history, they also say few words about the Jews of Iran, including the converts, the Mashhadi community that have been forced to convert into Islam, and they lived as Muslim outside and as Jews at home. The question about the Palestinians is a good question, and I think that one part of my problems with the policy of Israel is that we should have taken steps towards finding some solution with the Palestinians, not because of Iran, because of us, because of the Palestinians. But at that time, I think the Iranians would not have any excuse to say why they have to fight with Israel when the Palestinians are dealing with Israel. But they had their chance. Israel agreed with the Palestinians in 1983, the Oslo Accord, and it failed. So I think that here, again, it's both sides, it's pity, because at the end, the majority of the people of Israel accept that there should be a 2-state solution. There are many who think that we have to annex these West Bank parts and so on and so forth. Netanyahu is more than 10 years prime minister, 12 years. Had he wished to do it, he could have done it. And now, the deal with the Gulf states is that at least for the near future, its annexation is out of the table, or imposing the Israeli law in the West Bank. So it's pity. We used to say that the Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity, but it's the same with Israel. We should have taken more active policy on this issue. But every day, that every time that you come to this, there's going to be elections. Israel is on average election every 2.5 years rather than 4 years. In the last 2 years, there have been every 6 months. And I once asked one of the, at that time was president of the state, when the election campaign begins for the next election. And he told me the day after the election. So that politicians think they're always in this race to election. I wish to see a coalition government in Israel, putting aside all their differences, focusing on first on the corona, which is COVID-19 is giving hell to the people here. Me too, 11 months now I am at home. And this corona made me be aware of my age. I never thought that I belonged to the old people. And now officially I'm old, with all the benefits and all the problems with it. So, and the second issue, important issue, is our social issues between Jews and Jews in Israel, Jews and Arabs in Israel, religious and non-religious Israel, Sephardi and Ashkenazi in Israel. And when it comes to our neighborhood, of course, the Palestinian issue. I would love to have good relations with the Palestinians. In think tanks, we are sitting with Palestinians, we are sitting with people from all over the Middle East and talking. But at the end, is the government has to take the decision. And I don't see good intention or the sense of urgency that it's pity to have all this time pass by and we don't take any step forward. But it's going about Syria, I would tell you, it's a long story. Iran is today using proxies. They have made it into an art of how to take people of other countries and send them to sacrifice their life for your interest. Today they call it forward defense. I don't know what is forward defense. If you defend, it's not going forward. But Iran they're proud that they are now having four Arab capitals. We control 4 Arab capitals: Damascus, Beirut, Baghdad, Sana'a. They speak in the history of the Iranian empires, that they have been on the Mediterranean on one side and Bab el-Mandeb on the other side. The expenses the money that they spend, it's unbelievable. I'm now writing a book about Iranian regional policy, and I can tell you the figures that I see, I find it difficult to digest. How much Iran, which people suffer at home, pays for these adventures from Yemen to Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon for what? All these missiles. We didn't speak about Iranian regional policy as a threat to Israel, the missiles, when the missiles that they write on them in Hebrew, that Israel should be eliminated and destroyed. I wonder why they say Israel bayad mahwa nabud shavad. It should be eliminated and destroyed. If you eliminate Israel, what remains to be destroyed? Just to make sure to be on the safe that it's dead and buried. And you write on your missiles in Hebrew that even the president of Iran, Rouhani, complained why we are doing it. In addition to some intellectuals in Iran who say that what we gain from writing on these on our missiles that Israel should be eliminated. So it's there are different voices, but in Syria, the strange thing is that Syrians are not Shiite. They speak about the Shiite crescent. Alawites are not Shiites. Khomeini refused to recognize them as Shiites. The Houthis are hardly Shiites. They are closer to Sunnis than they are to Shiites. They're certainly not Ithna Ashari Shiite. So it's different, but they have common interest. I don't think that all this investment will pay. When interest would change in Iraq, we can see it right now, when they have to choose between the United States, the Iraqis, the United States, and Iran, they will opt for the United States. I think that even Bashar al-Assad, you cannot guarantee that he will be with the Iranians all the time. Then you have Russia, you have Turkey, we have a whole mess in these places. What I say, again, going something that has to do with humanism and human rights. It's breaks the heart to see that children from Afghanistan or Afghan who lived in Iran are being conscripted and sent to the front in Syria. And there are testimonies of children 14, 15 years old, and against the international law, they go to the front and fight and being killed. But Iran has its way to Qasem Soleimani, the late Qasem Soleimani, went to visit a family of a victim of this war in Syria. And it was nice of him. He was a man with charisma and admired by many people, and for good reason. He took this upon himself to go to the family and comfort them. For the father was killed, the husband was killed, and he ends with this. The final word was shocked me. He said, "You are lucky." Chosha behal shoma. How you translate it, my friend? Good for you. Lucky you that your father was killed. And they mean it because they think that that's the desire of the people. They go to the front. They desire to be martyrs. And I can tell you, this is not true. In 1988, Ayatollah Khomeini accepted the ceasefire because people were unwilling to go to the front. And you can hear now in interviews with the commanders of the Revolutionary Guards how devastating was the situation because the people were not. But during the war, the typical death notice in the Iranian newspaper was, "We congratulate the family of so and so for having their son killed in the war." They sent tabrik. So it's that's the mood that they created. But I think that after 42 years of Islamic revolution, people want to live. People want to live with dignity. And the slogan of Ayatollah Hujjat al-Islam Rouhani in 2013, he promised the people, he pledged, "I'm going to return to you the value of your passport and the value of the rial." This is the currency. I've never heard a president saying, or candidate for presidency, promising to return to you the value of your passport. I'm going to bring back to you the dignity that you deserve among the peoples of the nations of the world. And I'm going to return the value of the rial. The value of the rial has been deteriorated since many, many times.
We have some really interesting questions that relate to the other side of the coin from what we were just discussing, which is back to this question of kind of dialogue as opposed to regional tensions. One individual was involved in some interreligious dialogues years ago in the region. These talks were designed to, in addition to having some immediate benefits. They were designed to work toward an opportunity for the Pope to meet with Ali Sistani on behalf of a larger interreligious dialogue initiative. Now that meeting is planned. Do you see anything positive coming out of this meeting or other meetings like it? And then a related question.
You mean with whom? With Shahristani, you say?
Yes, the Pope and Sistani.
Sistani. You mean
And then there is
Ayatollah Sistani. Okay.
This is the question. I just read it as it was. And the other question is kind of asking you to draw on your knowledge of religious thought in Iran. You did a really great job in your lecture talking about the various views of different Ayatollahs and how they were not always in harmony with Khomeini's view. And so to sum up this question, is there some type of religious explanation that could be given by the supreme leader or other high-ranking Ayatollahs that could create a foundation for Iran living peacefully with Israel? So is there some type of religious explanation, theological argument, or whatever it may be that could actually facilitate dialogue and some sort of peaceful coexistence? So there's a question about the specific meeting and then about the broader intellectual possibilities.
It's an attempt to have a kind of conferences and meetings of Abrahamic religions. There's been several of them. It's in Spain, there was in other places, with the Vatican. I think that it makes sense because at the end of the day, they are all cousins. They follow the monotheistic faith, and we thought that when I participated in some of them, that it is a good way to present it, which is not political, but it's theological or religious thing. I have a history of more than 25 years of participating in all kinds of meetings, dialogues, and track two. It's wonderful. You meet and see that there are good people with good intentions. Sometimes something good comes out of this. But I think that at the end of the day, it's the politicians that they have to take the decision. And I think that we had leaders who have done it, be it Menachem Begin in 77, going with the peace with and Anwar Sadat of Egypt, and we had Yitzhak Rabin. Unfortunately, both Sadat and Rabin paid with their life for dealing with it. This region is full of people who are extremists from all sides. But to go with this under the umbrella of religion, that's at least the common denominator that you have. And if you can use it, and I tell you, religious people that participate in such dialogues find it more easy to speak with religious people on the other side. Ayatollahs can speak with rabbis. There is no much problem. That they both believe in God, and the rest is less important. The idea of having Sistani meeting with, I'm not sure it was the meaning, it was meant to Ayatollah Sistani. Ayatollah Sistani is the highest authority in Iraq. He is of Iranian origin, he's from Sistan. And he is, for example, this is an example of the diversity. He doesn't accept Ayatollah Khamenei. And he is the leader of the Shiites in Iraq. And now we made of this the Shiite crescent or Shiite Sunni dichotomy so much that I ask myself, let's take Shiites in Iraq. I like what I said about the Shiite so-called of Syria or of Yemen. The Shiite of Iran are the cousins and brothers of the Shiites of Iran. Both of them belong to the same sect of Islam. At the end of the day, are there Shiites, more Shiites or more Arab or more Iraqi? The more you look into it, you see that even the Shiites who are close to Iran, at the end of the day, they are Iraqi nationals. So it's very difficult to distinguish. But when you have a charismatic leader like Khomeini, he puts all others under his shadow. Today, we are in a situation in Iran that you don't have high-ranking authority, religious authority at the head of the state, like Khomeini. And Sistani is older than Khamenei, and he's not political. There are segments of Shiism which are more activist, like Khomeini, revolutionary, non-conformist. And then you have Sistani, who is quietist. Is everything easygoing, but if they meet with I know that the Vatican appreciate very much the Shia theology and Shia theologians. They know that they are, like in many other fields, they are very serious. And study and research done in Iran on Shiism is very, really advanced. But I don't know about the meeting between the Pope and Sistani. This will be almost impossible. You can't meet with Sistani without fighting with Khamenei. You know, they are all brothers, they are all Iranians, but the Iranians have another quality or not quality. They think that they are above others. If you look at, there are people here I know sitting here that they are who know Persian literature and how the Iranians over history had treated the Arabs. And it's about both Muslims, but they are different, and the Iranians are thinking about themselves that more distinguished people. They are superior, but deprived. So I don't know how to mitigate these two. But I want to maybe are we done or against one final point?
We have one more question, David. I think
Sure.
in terms of the narratives, theologians that we've talked about, as you know, you've been involved in so many conferences of Track 2. There are also some intellectuals inside Iran who have been very vocal about Iranian government's policy toward Israel. Sadiq Ziba Kalam. I don't know. Do scholars like you in Israel follow what some of those Iranian scholars are saying about how the Iranian regime needs to kind of lower the rhetoric? And I mean, Sadiq Ziba Kalam is very kind of exceptional here. He's on Twitter, he's on social media, continuously criticizing the harsh tone from Tehran. So,
when I spoke about voices coming from Iran, I didn't speak about people in diaspora. I spoke about people inside Iran.
I see.
All the examples that I gave is people inside Iran who are speaking the way they are speaking. It's easy when you sit in Beverly Hills to speak freely, but you speak from Iran, you go to jail, you come back and continue to struggle. I think that the Iranian intellectuals should be appreciated for their courageous struggle for freedom, men and women. And so many of them have been in jail. It's pity. I don't want to go to particular people, but yes, you mentioned one. And this man has a record, all of them, it's not only Iranians living in Iran, they are revolutionary Iranians, for God's sake. These people have served the revolution. Ziba Kalam was in the in Kurdistan during the first years of the revolution. He is a pious man, very religious. It's not only him. There are a series of people that we don't know. Of course, the Iranians know that. They speak publicly. They speak up even about the Holocaust. They set out against denial of Holocaust in Iran, people from Iran. While Iranian Jews usually are hesitant to speak about it, you can see Shiite Jews, Shiite Iranians who are speaking it. They have a lot of influence inside Iran. They have a lot of followers on Telegram, on other issues. They are so strong that it's very difficult to fight them. That's I tell you, I have a lot of appreciation. For example, during Khatami's period, going back, when you saw newspapers published in Iran, it was so refreshing. I gave a lecture 20-something years ago. No, not less than 20 years ago. I know it may be 2004. And I spoke about some relative freedom of expression in Iran under Khatami in the late 90s. It was a lecture to Israeli diplomats, veteran diplomats. And one of them asked me, you speak about relative freedom of expression, but how you explain that 100 liberal newspapers were shut down in 5 years, which was true. Well, I told him, show me another country in the Middle East which has 100 liberal newspapers to shut them down. Well, if you have 100 liberal newspapers, it's meaningful. Well, of course, you speak up, your newspaper is banned, you go to jail, then you come back. Most of the time you go to the United States or Canada or other places. Sometimes you live in the country. So I once asked an Iranian professor how he explains this dichotomy between relative free expression and suppression. And I think he resolved my problem. He told me, David, they tell you we don't have freedom of expression in Iran. That's not true. We have freedom of expression in Iran, but what we don't have is freedom after expression. So I think explains that the problem that the Iranians are, and it's the Iranian people, they deserve more freedom, but that's the destiny, that's the situation. And I think that at the end of the day, and I want to conclude with it, we professors, we often learn from our students. And in this case, I learned from an Iranian student. There was an article in Iranian newspaper in 1999 during the high time of freedom of liberalism, I would even say. And one Ayatollah wrote an article, Ayatollah Kermani, that he advised people not to cross certain red lines and to follow true Islam. And the young student wrote back a week after in the same newspaper, it was Jami'eh. Jami'eh is society. It was also the name of the newspaper. And this young student wrote, you preach us to follow true Islams, But could you tell us how many Islams are there? Who decides which of them is true and which of them is false? And what are the red lines? And he goes on to say, we are young and we want to live. We want to have good life. But you, the clerics, in a one-way street, you are driving against the flow of traffic. Now, people who have been in Iran, driving in Tehran, you know that it's a mess, worse than anywhere else in the world. But you cannot drive all the time against the flow of traffic. Now, at the end of the day, what I mean is that Iran has a tradition, unlike any other country in the Middle East, of popular uprisings. One of them, the man that your institute is called, his name Baskerville, 1906, 1909. Before that, there was 1891, 92, then 51, 53, then 79. You have 4 mass movements in 140 years. 2 big revolutions in 1 century. The constitutional and the Islamic revolution. There are not many nations that experience 2 mass popular revolutions in 1 century. So at the end of the day, the Iranians will do whatever it takes to change the destiny of their country. I remember in 2009, I was in a meeting with professors from many countries of the Middle East, and they were showing the pictures of the green movement in Iran. And there was an Egyptian woman, professor, she said, mashallah, mashallah, praised be God. When we are going to have such a movement in Egypt? It didn't take 2 years. And then you had the Arab Spring, which was the first experience for many Arab countries to have this kind of movement. So I think what we see with the young generation, with the development of new media, with education, so the expectation is there, and I'm sure they are not going to disappoint themselves and their families and the rest of the world, that these people will be more active in trying to try and change realities. The problem is that the clerics may be driving against the flow of traffic, but they have the power in hand to suppress. And in 1999, when young students went to uprisings in the Tehran University dormitories, and then they suppressed them. And there was Ayatollah Mesbah Yazdi, July 12, 1999, in Friday's sermon. He said that whoever thinks that Islam is a religion of mercy does not understand Islam. For God's sake, Islam is a religion of mercy. You say, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful. How you can, as a grand Ayatollah, say that Islam is not a religion of mercy, and say Islam dictates to us to take a sharp sword and cut the tongues or the throat of people who speak and act against us. So when you have this kind of license to suppress, it's easy to get them why you are not moving. They know what the price they're going to pay. So at the end of the day, it's up to the young people of Iran and women of Iran to make sure that their condition of life will be different. There are good people in Majlis, in government, who want to do the change, not all the way, but there are people who are capable of doing it. They don't have the tools, they don't have the power to make the difference. As I said earlier, the people who can produce a change do not desire yet.
Well, thank you so much, David,
Thank
for
you.
this really uplifting conversation. I think many of our attendees are so grateful to you and are asking us to continue these conversations on other topics later, because it is so important for us to kind of sustain this narrative of the dialogue that we are having here. And hopefully with Baskerville Institute, we would like to bridge that more in terms of this conversation series by bringing Iranian intellectual counterparts.
Well, you can bring Iranians, they would come. I
Yes.
don't think they have anything against you.
Yeah, yeah.
They
I'm
won't come
bringing,
to Israel, but to Zoom with American outlets, they will
yes.
be very happy to do it. I have a question to you now that we are done. First, thank you so much for hosting me here and tolerating me for so long. There are few people who wrote me notes. It's can I respond to it later on? Or?
Yes, you can. You can speak to it. We can email them. We will send you a list of their emails. And
Oh, please. So
if you
send
have,
me, is it possible to get a picture of the screen? And because
yes,
there are so many friends over there that I could not respond to each and every of them, but I know that the wisdom on Iran that you had on your audience, it's so high that you don't need people like me to come and tell them about Iran.
thank you so much, David. I think we are very fortunate to have scholars like you. And I think you have had so many students you have educated. And we did have a question on Iranian studies in Israel that we can ask you that in writing later on. A couple of good questions came about the future of Iranian studies in Israel and how do you see it. But I think this is a conversation that we're going to have to continue, and we would really appreciate it later if we could also have your other students who are involved in that Iranian studies to join us for this Zoom.
One of my former students, if she didn't leave this group, she was supposed to be on it.
Yes.
And I would make a contact. She is now the head of the Center of Iranian Studies. And I think that you should do something together. I think it's important. I saw what are the lectures that you have in near future. So it's will be very interesting to send me invitations.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for taking time. I know it's almost 10:30 at night or 11 in Tel Aviv. And we are really appreciative of the time zone that you took this time. Our next event is on Morgan Schuster.
Yeah, that's another hero. That's
yes.
another hero.
So we will definitely send the invites to all the Iranian studies faculty you have and everyone. And we hope you could join us for that talk on February 22nd on Morgan Schuster and his role in Iranian independence and freedom. And Matt, thank you so much again for moderating all those questions and being part of the Institute. And we are hoping to bring more involvement of different scholars, and with David's role here, we really appreciate that. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Please check our website. We will upload the video of David's talk, and we will send it to all the participants for their file they can look at. So check our website for our future developments. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.